Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. The 8-day holiday where Jews celebrate the religious freedom that their ancestors fought for against the Greeks, by giving 8 days of gifts and lighting a candle on the menorah every night. If you're a typical millennial Gentile like myself, then your only exposure to Hanukkah was probably the Rugrats holiday special.
A Maccabee's gonna do what a Maccabee's gonna do. Hanukkah! You have the when you say it.
Is it strange that was the only depiction of a Jewish family on children's television? Anyways, this holiday isn't just celebrating a historical idea or concept, but rather a historical event. It's the story I want to tell you today. But in order to understand this holiday, we're going to need some background information, which means we're going to need to go all the way back to the 6th century BCE. In 586, the Neo-Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem and exiled the Israelite elites to Babylon, where much of the Old Testament would be first put into writing. This was an extremely important process for the Jews living in exile because it kept them connected to their heritage and religion. And for historians, it transformed the Jews from an oral tradition people to one of a written history. This exile is referred to as the Babylonian Captivity, and it would finally be ended with the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539, which would give birth to the Achaemenid Persian Empire and allowed the Jewish elites to return to Israel. As Persia became more powerful in the eastern Mediterranean, it came into conflicts with the Greeks who had been colonizing the coasts. The Greek city-states had been so busy fighting each other that they couldn't defend their colonies in Asia Minor, allowing the Persians to conquer them. This would eventually spark the Greco-Persian Wars, with such famous battles as Marathon or Thermopylae. Yet despite their victories, Athens and Sparta would go back to fighting each other, with Persia taking sides depending on who they felt like beating up that week. The Greeks would eventually be unified by someone as they saw as an outsider, Philip II of Macedon, who would create an alliance of all the Greek city-states except for Sparta, and would eventually have a plan to invade Persia. Unfortunately though, Philip II died before that could happen, and the plan was picked up by his son, Alexander III, whom history knows better as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great would go on to conquer most of the known world up to that point, only to be turned back in Afghanistan when his army mutinied and refused to go any further. So he returned back west to his empire's new capital, Babylon, where he then proceeded to die of unknown causes. After his death, the empire was split up amongst his generals, who then began to fight with each other. Due to Israel being in the middle of the many east-west trade routes in the region, control of it has passed between many competing powers. Between the death of Alexander the Great and the events of Hanukkah, the city of Jerusalem would be passed back and forth between Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Persia, both being ruled by Greek dynasties. But by the 2nd century BCE, Jerusalem would be firmly into the hands of the Seleucids, and it would be against them whom the Jews would finally rebel. At this time, Rome was a rising power in the western Mediterranean, having just won the Punic Wars against Carthage. The Seleucids wanted to become the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and so they embarked on a disastrous war with the Romans over control of Greece, which they lost and would be forced to pay the Romans a large sum of money. The Seleucid ruler at this time, Antiochus III, would spend the short remainder of his reign fighting a war with the Parthians in an attempt to procure enough money to pay the Romans. This would continue under his son Seleucus IV, who would be assassinated in 175 and then be succeeded by his brother Antiochus IV. Ruling a multi-ethnic empire is difficult, and it would be a whole lot easier if they had a single culture to unify them. Well, this is what I think Antiochus IV was doing. This plan was similar to that of Alexander the Great, except Alexander the Great wanted to create an empire with a merged culture of East and West, which is why he took a Persian bride, as well as forcing many of his generals to also take Persian wives, in order to create a Greco-Persian ruling class that could eventually bring the culture down further to the common peoples. And this process of spreading Greek culture, often referred to as Hellenization, was actually embraced by some Jews, as recorded in the book of Maccabees. "Come, let us make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, because ever since we have kept ourselves separated from them, we have suffered many evils." Greek architecture would become more common in the land of Israel, seeing temples to Greek gods and sporting arenas, where Jewish athletes would compete in the nude like their Greek counterparts. This was not too well received by the more traditional Hebrew populace, and things were only going to get worse. At this time, Jerusalem was ruled by a high priest appointed by the Seleucid king. At the time of Antiochus IV's ascension, the high priest was Onias III, who was a very Orthodox Jew, but he was replaced by his brother Jason, who had promised Antiochus greater tax revenues and was more friendly to the Hellenists. A group of Orthodox Jews, referred to as the Hasidim, formed a resistance movement to the Hellenists. Needless to say, Antiochus was not a fan of this group, and was looking for a way to eliminate them. He found an opportunity to do so with a rival of Jason's, Menelaus, who offered even greater tax revenue than Jason did, and was an active Hellenist. Jason was removed from the position of high priest and replaced by Menelaus, who allowed further Hellenization. Jason would not take this lying down. When Antiochus went on campaign to conquer Egypt, Jason took an army he assembled and attempted to capture Jerusalem. The attack was a failure, but it revealed to Antiochus that the Hellenist policies were not favored by a majority of the populace. After returning from his failed conquest of Egypt, he sent an army to occupy the city, and on the Sabbath day he launched an attack on all of Menelaus' more orthodox opponents and destroyed the walls around Jerusalem so that it would never become a hub of resistance. He not only made the city physically weak to attack, but also robbed the temple of all of its riches. Flavius Josephus describes the robbing of the temple in the 12th book of the Jewish Antiquities. The king came up to Jerusalem, and, pretending peace, he got possession of the city by treachery, at which time he spared not so much as those that admitted him into it, an account of the riches that lay in the temple. But led by his covetous inclination, and in order to plunder its wealth, he ventured to break the league he made. So he left the temple bare, and took away the golden candlesticks and the altar of burnt offerings, and left nothing at all remaining. The sacking of the temple would not be the last of Antiochus's assault on the Jews. The book of Maccabees describes further decrees after the desolation. The king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah containing orders to follow customs foreign to the land, to put a stop to burnt offerings and meal offering and libation in the temple, to violate Sabbath and festivals, to defile temple and holy things, to build illicit altars in illicit temples and idolatrous shrines, to sacrifice swine and ritually unfit animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to draw abomination upon themselves by means of all kinds of uncleanliness and profanation, so as to forget the Torah and violate all the commandments. And whoever disobeyed the word of the king was put to death. From the perspective of Orthodox Jews, this was an all-out assault on their religion and their way of life. And from a modern perspective, you could even describe this as a cultural genocide. However, there are alternative views to this conflict. The Book of Maccabees portrays this conflict as a war of liberation, but some modern scholars describe it simply as a civil war between Hellenized Jews and more Orthodox Jews, in which the Seleucids simply took the side of the Hellenists. In this interpretation, the laws against Jewish customs were little more than an administrative punishment over a province. This interpretation is somewhat supported by Flavius Josephus, who wrote in 1st century Roman Palestine. In chapter 5 of the Antiquities, he portrays the conflict as a rivalry between the high priests Jason and Menelaus, who according to Josephus were brothers, thereby emphasizing this idea that this conflict was an internal one between Jews. There's merits to this idea, but there are problems with its interpretation. Although he describes the rivalry between Jason and Menelaus as the origins of the conflict, he still does point out that the Maccabees didn't revolt until after Antiochus made his anti-Jewish decrees. On top of this, there's no evidence outside of Josephus that Jason and Menelaus were actually brothers. But more importantly than that, there are some context that needs to be understood about Josephus and the time he was writing in. At the time of his writing, Israel was under the control of the Romans, who had just put down a Jewish revolt in 70 CE, which resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple. His books were being written for a Roman audience, so for his own safety, he wasn't going to portray a Jewish revolt against a Hellenized power in a positive light. Regardless of why these decrees were made, they would spark a negative reaction amongst the populace and create a wider revolt. It began with a priest named Mattathias, who had 5 sons, the most prominent of which was Judah, whose nickname was Maccabeus, which in Hebrew means the hammer. When Antiochus's officials reached his village, Modin, Mattathias was asked by them to make a sacrifice to the Greek gods, but he refused. And when he did so, another Jew from the crowd came up and offered to make the sacrifice in his place. When this happened, Mattathias and his sons drew their swords and slayed the one who had come forward to make the sacrifice, as well as the official who had ordered them to do so. After this, Mattathias is said to have shouted, "All who are zealous for the sake of the Torah, who uphold the covenant, march out after me." After which he and his sons ran off into the wilderness, formally starting the Maccabean revolt. The rebels, who would become known as the Maccabees, would fight a guerrilla war against the Seleucids for 7 years. Personally, I'm not too interested in the details of the fighting itself, but I will give you some necessary bullet points about the conflict. The war started in 167 BCE and lasted until 160. Mattathias would die in 165, whereupon his son, Judah the Maccabee, would take his place as the leader of the revolt. A series of battles would eventually give the Maccabees control of the city of Jerusalem in 164, where Mattathias' youngest son, Johnathan, would be made the high priest of Jerusalem. A Seleucid army was sent in order to retake Jerusalem, But later in 164, after the death of Antiochus IV, a general decided to recall the army in order to deal more with internal affairs. Between 164 and 160, a compromise was made between the Seleucids and the Maccabees ruling Jerusalem, in which the land of Judea was granted autonomy within the empire, and religious liberty was restored to the Jews. It is after the capture of Jerusalem in which the Miracle of Hanukkah is supposed to have taken place. For those who don't know, when the temple was retaken by the Jews, they needed to get rid of all the Greek statues and other unclean things that the Greeks had been doing inside the Second Temple. After the repairs were made, they sought to relight the candelabra that was supposed to remain lit at all times, but there was only enough oil to last one night. It was going to take the priests at least 8 days to make more oil, but they decided to light it anyway, and according to the legend, it lasted 8 nights. This story is probably why Josephus coined the term Festival of Lights for Hanukkah. The exact origin of this story is unclear. It's not recorded in the Book of Maccabees or in the writings of Josephus. The lighting of the candelabra is mentioned in Maccabees, but the oil lasting for 8 days is not mentioned in any of those texts. The miracle of the oil is first mentioned in the Talmud around 400 CE. Of course, this didn't mean that the story didn't exist before then. After all, the stories of the Old Testament were preserved by oral traditions of the Israelites until they were written down during the Babylonian exile. So there's no reason to suspect that the stories about the oil had not been passed down orally as well. So there ends the story of Hanukkah, or at least the part of the story I'm going to be telling you in this video. I'm planning on telling you what happened after this in another video, so stay tuned for that. If you are interested in going into further detail, I have my sources listed in the description, and amongst those sources, I should have some Amazon affiliate links, which will take you to where you can buy physical hard copy sources of the books I used to write this video. If you use the links I've provided in the description, that'll give this channel some financial support and allow me to keep making videos. If you're not interested in buying books but would still like to financially support this channel, you can always do so on patreon.com/GrantHurst, where contributions are always welcome. You can also support this channel by watching the videos and sharing them on social media. And make sure you never miss a video by subscribing to this channel and by clicking the bell icon so you'll be notified whenever new content is released. And that is all for now. Thank you for watching. I hope I did this story justice, and to all my Jewish viewers, Happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah, oh Hanukkah, come light the menorah. Let's have a party, we'll all dance the hora. Gather around the table, we'll give you a treat. Said we will mean to play with them like this. And while we are playing, the candles are burning low. One for each night they shed a sweet light to remind us of days long ago.